Okay. Well, as we are getting going, good morning, everyone out there in YouTube land. We have been having a nice chat about the snow and the crazy people who try to go golfing in the snow and things like that. But we're going to turn to our study for this morning. So we're on week 6 of our study of the book of James, and we are finishing up chapter 4 and starting chapter 5 today. And I suddenly can't, I think next week will be our last week on this study. So we are coming close to the end of this one, and I think that means Will and I need to have a conversation about what we're going to turn to after this.
Yeah, this kind of took us through the end of this season, and then after that Sunday we'll be getting into the season of Lent, and so we'll have a season to go along with that that Lenten journey of some sort. So we'll send out some details of that soon. But for now, we get to finish up James, which is exciting.
Yeah. So we're today returning to a really dominant topic in the book of James, which is that of right speech. And if you have access to the handout from for today on our website, I listed at the very beginning of the handout all of these different places through the book of James where right speech comes up. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start by talking about chapter 4 with verses 11 through 12 here. Let's see. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Will someone read verses 11 and 12 for us to start out?
I will.
Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and the judges of the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor?
Thank you. So we let's start our discussion here today, and I'll swap us over to our Bible study guide for today. In our culture, our current life, we are living in a time when a lot of people will reference this passage kind of casually as you can't judge me, it's only God can judge someone. And I'm wondering, so the example I give is, it's a line in a Miley Cyrus song where she's literally talking about doing cocaine, which I think we can all agree is not advisable. But she says, remember, only God can judge us. Forget the haters. Somebody loves you. And that's just maybe not the way that we interpret this. So in these verses, how is maybe what James is saying about judgment different from what we in our culture hear people say about, like, you can't judge me, only God can judge me? Or is there a difference? Do we see a difference in that different way of processing what judgment means?
Well, he starts off talking about speaking evil, and so I'm trying to think about how the word judging and speaking evil against someone, how they kind of go together, and so because we tend to think of judging as saying, oh, you're doing something wrong or whatever, but it may be a way of speaking against someone to make yourself be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the idea of slander is definitely a part of it.
Don't we have to judge to a certain extent? For instance, the difference between right and wrong, that's a judgment call. And it's not judging like we're talking about final judgment or God's judgment. But we do have to judge to a certain extent. Now, some of us, like, I'm way too judgmental in the wrong ways. But in some ways, we do need to judge. That's why we have a justice system.
Well, it,
Yeah.
it also talks about, if you're a judger of the law, then you're not doing the law. And I think about somebody going along, and I've actually been guilty of this, of saying, I'm driving down the bypass, and it goes from 45 to 35, and everybody's still going 45, and I'm thinking, yeah, this is really silly. I don't know why they didn't just keep it at 45. So I'm judging the fact that the speed limit isn't what I would like it to be, and so therefore I'm going to be like everybody else and just drive 45 through there by Locust and Park Street because everybody does it. And so I'm kind of judging. I mean, it's a simple example, but I'm judging the law, and definitely by judging, I'm going, so therefore I'm not going to do it.
But Larry, that same stretch you're talking about, I understand why it's 35, and I get irritated at drivers who don't do 35. So that's where I judge. That's where it comes in. Not that the law's wrong, but that the people are wrong.
And I do think there's some, I think there's times where it's appropriate for us to name what is destructive and harmful. For us to say to someone that their behavior is destructive toward themselves or toward another person is not passing judgment in a way that is inappropriate. It's naming really harmful behavior. And I think that is necessary. I think one of the differences comes though in who are we naming that in? Are we naming harmful behavior in ourselves? Are we naming harmful behavior for the people who we have close relationships with, who trust our judgment, who trust our input in their lives? I think that when we look at these verses, and I'll share it again, when it says, do not speak evil against one another, when it says to not speak slander, it appears as if it's really focusing on, if you're going to share something about what should be or should not be happening, it has to be with someone that lives by the same standard you do. So it doesn't make sense for me to walk out and start, being one of those people who just passes broad judgment against the entire world, because I can't necessarily say to people who don't live by the gospel that they absolutely have to repent and live the way that I think they should, without building relationship with them that goes along with calling them towards something better.
Yeah, I agree. There's such a selfishness to saying no one can judge me. It's all about me and what I want. And I think so much of this is trying to redirect that kind of judging to be, yes, still discerning and analyzing and thinking critically and all that, but it's not about doing what I want and judging others or being sort of selfish about it. So much there's a humility that we've seen in this book that I think has to carry through here as well.
Yeah. As we kind of move forward with these verses, what shows up consistently in the different commentaries is the implication here is that to speak evil or to slander someone is to place yourself above your neighbor and to put yourself in a elevated standing and to lower the standing of someone else. The question I have is, why are we so tempted to do that to one another as we look to other people? What is it that's so tempting about elevating the self over someone else?
It's a great question. While we're chewing on that, I was reading a comment that popped up from Barbara Moore on YouTube saying, I think there's a distinction here between the law, lowercase l, and the law, capital L, which is more like judging God. And criticizing fellow Christians is more what this is about. So saying that, yeah, it's helpful to bring that into.
Yeah.
Sorry to pull away from your question, Val. Yeah, because
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Why is it that we just automatically put ourselves on top and as the one who knows best and looks around and sees what everyone else is doing wrong?
We don't observe ourselves. in the way we observe other people. It's like the speck in the eye. You can't see it. But you surely can see the other person's eye and his or her shortcomings, and only too happy to point them out.
Yeah. And when we get into the specifics of it, it's much easier for us to point out a sin or a hardship that we ourselves have not had to experience. So it's, you know, a easy shot, an easy example is it's easy for someone who has never been faced with making a decision about whether or not to carry out a pregnancy to have an opinion about being pro-choice or pro-life or whatever. But it's incredibly different to be someone who's in that position. And until someone stands there, you know, you just really don't know how you're actually going to react and what you would do. And so it's small things like that, but even things like Larry shared about, you know, I think that speed limits are ridiculous and I'm going to continue going 45 if I want to go 45 because everybody else is doing it too. Like, I agree. I tend to be the one who's on that side of the argument also. And so it's tempting to do the act of putting myself above everyone else because everybody else around me is doing it too. You know, we live in this culture where people are constantly self-promoting, and the age of social media has made that even greater for young people in our culture to feel like they have to promote a certain image of self that makes them look like they're having a better time or living a better life than other people. And that extends even into our young Christian communities where, you know, look at the picture I'm posting of my Bible study that I did today. And, you know, I'm so thankful for all of, you know, #blessed kind of a life. And it just becomes a way of bragging about, look, I have a better faith than you do.
Also, like to piggyback on something that Jack said, you know, the old saying, you know, don't judge a person until you've walked a mile in their shoes or in their moccasins or whatever they need you to. But it's, to me, it's about relationship. I can't walk in someone else's shoe. Literally, I can't do that. I can't be that person and have gone through what they've gone through and be in their situation. But if I'm in relationship with them, chances are that I can at least know enough to, if I can somehow affect them because they need some guidance, or rather than, I'm not going to call it judgment, but guidance or whatever for me, then because we've been in a relationship, that's possible. Whereas we tend to be most harsh, I think, on people that we don't know very well and large groups of people that we can lump together and say, this group is, you know, because they're not on my side, then they're awful. And, you know, so it's about relationship and trying to be empathetic with people.
Yeah. I'll share my screen again. Will someone read verses 13 through 17 for us? And as we're reading these, kind of keep in mind that idea of arrogance, of promoting oneself.
I'll read it. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a town and spend a year there, doing business and making money. Yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wishes, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin. And I have to say that's one of my favorites because that's me in 17.
Okay. Would you like to say a little bit more about that for us, how you see yourself there?
Because I've been brought up in a Christian home, I've always known, I think, what's right or wrong, but I haven't always done it. And there was a stretch in my life in particular where I wasn't living what I knew was the right way to live.
Yeah. And I think that is for people who have grown up with an awareness around faith and around, just general Christianity, that's common for many of us to have a period of time where we recognize later on, wow, I really wasn't following what I knew to be right. I really had that period of rebellion. But that is one of those differences for us reading this scripture versus the original intended audience of this letter. Those first generations of Christians were almost all people who converted from something else, or who were brought into the community of faith from a previous other religion, or those who were Jewish being brought into the following of Jesus. And for us, we read this in a completely different way, because it's like Jackie said, I've known this since I was a little small child, versus someone who maybe originally heard this in the first generation of Christian faith, who was saying, well, I know what the right thing is to do now, so I should do it now. And they don't necessarily have that background of, I've known this my entire life. It's just different. So keeping in mind that mindset of arrogance, this continues kind of moving us forward, an argument about arrogance through this section of James. And he's kind of addressing this idea of arrogance that places yourself in control of all resources and all financial gain. He's saying, you think you have control over what will come tomorrow, and you think you know what your life will consist of. You boast about this. One of the thoughts that feels a little convicting to me in this is that when we are doing our life in a manner that focuses on control of resources, we are assuming that there is only a certain amount of resources available, and that there's not enough for everyone, and that we have to get enough for ourselves. How do we see that type of arrogance playing out in the world that we are living in? What are some examples you can think of in your own life, or that you have observed culturally, where we're kind of grabbing for resources? One of them that comes to my mind is, we heard this last week that Jeff Bezos is going to retire as the CEO of Amazon. And one of the articles reported that his current personal value is at $956 billion. And I just can't even imagine what a human being would do with that much of a resource at their fingertips, just for themselves.
Yeah, on a much smaller scale, I think about the frenzy before the snowstorm, going to the grocery store and at the beginning of the pandemic, the run on toilet paper and whatever else, that we all like to talk about. But there is a certain scramble to make sure I've got mine, that I feel like is natural and in some ways is responsible, making sure you're prepared. But at the same time, there is I think sometimes in moments of crisis, even the small crisis of a couple inches of snow coming, we feel that gut reaction of, let me make sure I've got enough stuff to make sure I have what I need. And I think that's sometimes telling to see that.
Yeah. I think the toilet paper one feels a little personally convicting, because after having had to spend several months buying an off-brand of toilet paper, now every time I go to the store, I walk down the aisle to see if my favorite brand is in stock. And if it is, I just grab one. I have like 3 of them sitting in my closet right now, and I live alone.
Martha Ballinger added a comment on YouTube, people who break in line for a vaccine, which is particularly infuriating right now, isn't it? When you see people with resources and wealth or whatever it may be that find some workaround to get to the front of the line for a vaccine. Mm-hmm.
That is so good. That's so true. I think there's also something to be said about the way we need to reevaluate our prioritization in our economy when, you know, there's these groups of young people and small time investors online who are trying to fight back against these really big hedge funds by buying up stock for dying companies and, you know, just trying to play the system a little bit. I think that's proof that our culture just has our priorities out of whack. If it's at a point where that many people feel a need to make a point economically in our system. So one of the things that just comes to my mind is that I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago in another section, is that we just assume that power and resources are like pie, and there's only so many pieces of pie available, and I want all the pie that I can get. And we don't realize that, like, there's enough pie for everyone if you just let everybody have one piece of pie. And I think that's the thing about the gospel, is that it's the great equalizer, and we want to, the point of the gospel is to give everybody a piece of pie at the end of the day, right? Like, whatever the pie is, whether that's food or love or inclusion, there's enough to go around for everybody.
I'm not quite sure if this fits in or not, but Joanne and I got our vaccination this past week. And when we got home, I said to her, you know, I didn't see any people of color. I wonder if they are able to get to, I can't think now, the shopping center we were in town, but I began to think of, you know, are they going to be doing this out? What's the area where there's a lot of mobile homes, and I think a lot of.
I think in Southwood, maybe?
Yes, that's it. I think finally Southwood, as of a few years ago, now has a bus connection, but the vaccine's going to go to Southwood because those people are more vulnerable than the rest of us.
Jack, that's such a great point. That's such a great point. I watched a video that was done by the University of Maryland. Well, it was a panel hosted by the University of Maryland Medical School, and they spoke first with Dr. Anthony Fauci about what is happening in the pandemic and specifically how it has been hitting communities of color. But then the second half of their panel discussion was with Black faith leaders talking about the role of the church in encouraging people to participate, and about how much concern and genuine worry there is in communities of Black people and other people of color that participating in taking a vaccine could be a problem for them, because there's been a history of, like, the Tuskegee experiments was a big part of what they talked about. There's been experiments done on people of color in the history of our country without their consent and without their knowledge. And there's so much anxiety and worry about that still present in those communities. And so these faith leaders were talking about the role of primarily Black congregations in spreading accurate information and participating in getting people vaccinated or participating in vaccine trials. And I think you bring up a wonderful point that we have to have an awareness of that as well. It can't just be on Black faith leaders to be taking part in that. We have to be speaking up for the benefit of those places in our community that don't have the same access.
We've got several comments that have popped in the last minute, so let me just read a few of those because this is a great conversation. Betty Barker said that I have a hard time judging people because when I think about it, I have to ask, how am I doing? Walking in someone's shoes we know nothing about. Although as a human, yes, I have judged people, probably not knowing the circumstances. So I think there's that humility to try to look back at ourselves and say, oh, how am I really doing? Barbara Moore asked, kind of tried to find that balance here, that this passage is, she said, it's not saying to just live day to day without planning for the future, right? So there's it's not just sort of this carefree, careless approach. Elizabeth Mulcahy paraphrased Gandhi here to say, the world has enough for human need, but not enough for human greed. There's enough for what everyone needs, but not enough for a few to hoard the wealth. We were talking about before. And then one last one, looking at, I guess, this passage where it talked about how we don't know the future and it's not guaranteed and there's uncertainty. Barbara thinks back to Irene a few years ago, who had saved and worked to the very last minute and died within a year, and had no idea of what lay ahead. That whether it's cancer or an accident, or none of us knows what our timeline looks like, what our life on Earth will be. And so I know that in some ways that's really disconcerting, and at the same time it's also humbling, I think, and to realize this is what we have right now and we don't know what else may lie ahead. I think about that a lot during the pandemic, as we've often kind of put things off until, when this is all over, we'll do whatever, or we'll be happy after whatever. Now I'm just sort of rambling, but there's some sort of meme I saw somewhere that said being an adult is just saying things will calm down next week over and over again until you die. That's what it is to be an adult. It's like, or at least a parent, I don't know, whatever. It's things will get better soon. And I think this passage challenges that habit that we have to just sort of keep looking ahead or looking back to those were the good old days. Either way, it's coming back to where we are now, and recognizing the gift of this. So.
Let's read these last 6 verses before we run out of our time here. So chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, if someone will read those for us.
I will.
Thank you, Shirley.
Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one, who does not resist you.
I think briefly what this brings to mind for me, an image, when we talk about the laborers who mow fields and the things you keep back by fraud, think back to the book of Ruth and the moments when it talks in chapter 2 about Boaz being this great man who's respected in his community. And how does he show that he's a man of God? He leaves the corners of his field unharvested so that those who are poor can come along behind and gather for themselves. And when he recognizes that Ruth has great need and that Ruth and Naomi are going to starve, he tells his workers, leave even more in the field for these other people like Ruth to be able to gather. And so in response to what Barbara shared, I don't think that we are called to just live day to day with no semblance of idea for the future. But I do think that this original audience of this letter probably was living much more day to day than we are in our lives. They had a very subsistence level of existence, whereas we have more opportunity to prepare for the future. But I think we are called to live the way that Boaz lived. Boaz had plenty, and he was aware that he had plenty, and so he gave away the extra, and he kept enough to be prepared to make it through, but he didn't keep so much that he was hoarding what other people could benefit from. And I think that is what James is really pointing at in these sections. So I guess the question I'll close this with, because we are here at 10:30 now, is we come to these points of arrogance and we recognize it in our lives. And we see the ways that it shows up for us easily, especially because we have enough. We live in an economy where generally the majority of people have enough. But how do these acts of, we envy the things that others have, and we have this arrogance where we promote ourselves above the other? How do these show up in our lives in non-material ways? We talked about the stuff. What are the other ways that this shows up that's not a tangible thing, or that's money that we hold on to?
I think about success and achievement, different kinds of ways, and I think we're a very success-oriented culture, and I think even within our congregation and kind of where we not inside the congregation, but just sort of where we're situated. And I think there's a lot to be looking successful and appearing that sort of thing. I think is a real temptation for us, to where our arrogance and envy can show up. Look at how this person has it all together, or whatever that may be. I think it's often sort of unconscious or not quite conscious, but it's often in the background. It's the way we compare ourselves to others.
I think also of the envy of relationships. I had a conversation with a close friend where she talked about the envy that she feels because she's still single and she sees these other friends of ours who are married and having kids, and she just is very jealous of that. Or I had a conversation with my mother last week where she talked about the jealousy she feels when she sees other friends of hers with their grandchildren, and she's sad that she doesn't have any grandchildren. And there's just those differences in relationship that we wish we had a better relationship with so and so like that person does, or I wish I had more of these relationships in my life. Are there any other comments on our YouTube, from our YouTube friends, before we wrap ourselves up here?
Do we ever reach a point where we're satisfied with our stock in life?
I think that's the question. Yeah, that's the question we dwell on daily, is am I satisfied with what I have and where I'm at?
Because I think we kind of know on some level that if we're not satisfied with what we have now, we're not going to be satisfied by having a little bit more either. I mean, there is a certain level of, if you're starving and you need more food to survive, that would be more satisfying. But I think beyond that, what is it that really is going to satisfy us if we don't have enough now? Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all for your wonderful input and participation, and the great comments that have come in from YouTube this morning. We love having all of the participation out there from more of our community. So I'll just close us briefly with a word of prayer, and then we will see you in a few minutes for worship. God, I am grateful for the gifts that you give to us, and I'm grateful that we happen to be in a place where we are blessed with enough from day to day. But I thank you for the reminder about those in our community, those in our direct circles who do not have enough. We are mindful of, especially right now, our neighbors of color who are struggling more as a result of this pandemic. We ask that you would help us to find ways to work for equal access in our communities. May we now go with this question of, what will it take for me to feel like I have enough, on our minds. Help us to reflect well upon that this week, so that as we wrap up our study on James next week, we can come together with grace for ourselves, grace for one another, and an eagerness to continue learning from what James has to teach us. We pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you all.